going to continue in Matthew 13. Obviously, we read that section, and that's where we spent our time last week as well in the parable before, right? We're in this section of parables. There's several of them back to back, and Jesus starts many of them with that phrase, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to, or what other translations say, the kingdom of heaven is like. And we're going to go with that because it's a little bit pithier and it rolls off my tongue better. So the kingdom of heaven is like. And there's this reality of what is Jesus doing? Like, why does he have to tell them this over and over again and in so many different ways? Well, it's pretty cool, not only that Jesus did that, but that Matthew, by inspiration of the Spirit, decided to organize his book with these things back to back to back. And the idea is, or the reality of, often, like as parents, when we have to emphasize something over and over and over again, it's because my children have one expectation and reality is far different from their expectation. And so we're trying to match those two things up. It's like when you're a kid who's born in Ohio, and your whole life growing up, you hear people talk about this like place called In-N-Out Burger. And they talk about it with such reverence and love and care and concern, like it's the greatest thing ever. And then you get there and you're like, man, Five Guys is better. Or whatever else it might be. You might disagree with me, that's okay. Courtney's in. But it's like expectation and reality. What do you expect going in and what is reality? And some of that is what Jesus is doing here. That's not all of what he's doing. He's legitimately teaching them what the kingdom of heaven is. But as we look at it tonight, let's think about expectation versus reality. So, expectation, the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, in order to be a kingdom, what's like the one requirement? A king. Exactly. There needs to be a ruler. And in this way, expectation and reality were met. Throughout the Old Testament, there were promises of a coming Christ, Messiah, King. Right? One who would fulfill that covenant that God made with David. There would be a coming king. And so that expectation pretty much meets reality, right? If you start talking about a coming king, it's just now who's that king, right? And Jesus declares, Matthew chapter 4, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Encourages people to repent, to turn aside. And he begins to teach them what that is. Now, at that point in time, expectation of what that king would look like and what that king would do was very much like warrior king. Like, let's go. We got these Romans. They're imposing their way of life upon us. They're imposing a large sum of taxes upon us. And we would like freedom from those things. We would like to worship our God the way that we believe he intended us to, in freedom, without having to pay all these unnecessary taxes. Let's just focus on the temple tax and taking care of the Levites and things like that. But you see, that's not really what happened, right? Where they wanted this immediate liberation, this immediate flourishing, this immediate freedom. Instead of a warrior king, Christ came preaching a kingdom that showed enemy love, that turned the other cheek, that embraced the Gentiles, that agreed that the Torah was beautiful and wonderful and God-given and lovely in all of its ways, but felt like the establishment had used that to their own benefit. So he upended some of their expectation there. Instead of this full liberation and flourishing and the immediacy of takeover, or some sort of immediate theocracy installed as this new king and this new Israel and all rebuilt, it looked like weeds planted next to wheat. It kind of like it was slow. It was different. N.T. Wright describes God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven like this. He said, Jesus said it would come through the pure in heart, the meek, the mourners, the people hungry for justice, and so on. And that's what we see. That's what we see. Expectation and reality. They stand opposed to each other a little bit here. And so as we consider the kingdom of heaven being like, let's think about what it means to be wheat and weeds growing up together in the field of a good farmer. Well, the kingdom of heaven is like mercy, grace, justice. Think about this, right? They plant the seed. The farmer spends good money on good seed. And it's clear that there were options, right? Because the servants come back to him and say, well, didn't you buy good seed? Meaning he could have bought poor or substandard seed. But he spent the money to buy good seed, and he planted it in the field, or his servants planted it in the field. And after some time, it grows up, and they notice that there's not only this wheat, but there's also all of these weeds. This part always fascinates me because there's the reality of like, the culture was an honor-shame culture. And that God doesn't mind when things aren't as clean as we want them to be. Like that reality of a nice clean field with just good seed would be really clean and pretty and beautiful. And yet somehow the weeds growing among the wheat is what the kingdom of heaven is like, and he leaves it that way in his mercy. Because this idea of mercy, right, is withholding judgment or holding back judgment that could be very well rendered. And so upon the weeds, this farmer was fully within his right to send his servants back in and to have them all pluck them out, right? End their growth, end their development, burn them right then. But it stayed. And that's also mercy not only unto the weeds, but also toward the wheat. Because the wheat very well, as was pointed out, the farmer, right? This is not earth-shattering, it's just me rephrasing what's said. The weeds, while being pulled out, would often uproot other plants. Anybody ever, well, I know Becca gardens. Anybody else ever garden? You pull weeds and sometimes like the plant next to it is pulled. I was a part of a community garden one time, and this guy thought an eggplant was a weed, and so he pulled it out, and then he realized what he had done, and so he buried it at the bottom of the compost so that nobody would know. It's a terrible example off the top of my head, but like that reality of like sometimes when you're weeding, mistakes get made. Now, God doesn't make mistakes, but man, in his mercy, he lets us grow up among weeds. Not only that, but there's also this reality that oftentimes plants, when they're growing at different stages, look a lot like each other. Again, this Midwestern kid, there's this thing called Virginia creeper that grows all over Ohio. Virginia creeper is a really cool plant. It's a vine. It has leaves of 3, and it's often found in the forest. Now, does anybody know the pithy rule, leaves of 3, let it be, right? Well, the Virginia creeper looks exactly like poison ivy. And I know from experience that I'm not very good at telling the difference between the two because I have gotten poison ivy plenty of time. And you get that wrong enough and you get red and itchy and it's uncomfortable. But the reality is that oftentimes weeds look a lot like wheat at different stages in their lives. Now, at the end of this section, right, this idea is put forth. The Son of Man will send his angels. They will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and lawbreakers. If we're thinking about weeds as all causes of sin and lawbreakers, I start to think about my life. How much of it, my life, looked like all causes of sin and lawbreakers, or full of breaking the law. And how grateful I am that God, in his mercy, decided to let the weeds grow up among the wheat. Because my life looked a whole heck of a lot more like a weed than it did a wheat for a long period of that time. It looks like grace. That's mercy. The kingdom of heaven looks like grace. Both the weeds and the wheat are given access to good soil. The assumption is that if the farmer was willing to spend money on good seed, he was also willing to take care of his soil and make sure it was good. They're given nutrients, rain, sunlight, the ability to grow. God's grace, God's favor, God's blessing upon his people comes equally, right? Yeah. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. The kingdom of heaven looks like mercy. The kingdom of heaven looks like grace. But the kingdom of heaven does also look like justice. It's easy to get so caught up in letting the weeds grow up among the wheat that we don't think about the reality that there is justice at the end. And there is. You know, the really cool thing about justice is the wheat don't get to decide what justice looks like for the weeds. The other plants, even the servants, don't get to decide what justice looks like for the weeds. It's the farmer who does. And really, that's what puts this whole parable together. Throughout the entire thing, we could focus just on weeds. We could focus just on wheat. But weeds and wheat don't have a whole lot of control in this scenario. Every bit of this scenario, except for the enemy coming in and sowing, but even that, the Son of Man allows, is controlled by the farmer. He's the one who bought the good seed. He's the one who instructed his servants to go and plant it. He's the one who, when a problem arose, the servants listened to and obeyed his command. And he's the one who had the plan for what to do at the end to see maximum harvest. You see, in all of this, the kingdom of heaven, as we said, in order for it to be a kingdom, there must be a king. There's that beautiful reliance on the king or the farmer throughout this scenario. You know, there's a lot of ways that I could re-illustrate Jesus' parable, but I want to tell you a story about a guy named David. I've never met David, but David changed my life. David was a terrible child. Like the worst child you can think of, and then multiply that by 10. Like all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, that's like a picture of David in the dictionary. David was in and out of juvie as a kid. Did terrible things to a lot of people. And it just kept building and building and building. David was convinced that there was no God, and therefore he believed that he could define his own morality, that he could define right and wrong, and he was convinced that the system had it wrong. And so he lived by completely different rules, which is obviously, when you start doing that, that's why you end up in juvie. And then when he became an adult, at around the age of 18, he committed a crime so heinous against his family, or a member of his family, that he was put in prison for 10 years. Now, in prison, David made a quick friend, this guy named Randy. Now, all Randy wanted to talk about was the Bible. And that annoyed David, because he felt like the only reason Randy believed in the Bible is because he was born in a Christian culture, to Christian family, and all this stuff. Now, I don't know how Randy ended up in prison too, but listen, wheat often looks like weeds. So Randy would talk about the Bible and he would fast. And David was a competitive guy and he liked to argue. And so he tried to out-fast Randy. He would just go on hunger strike after hunger strike. So much so that they put him in solitary confinement because they were concerned that he was going to starve himself to death, trying to beat Randy at fasting, just to one-up on him. Well, because in solitary, they were also forcing nutrients and forcing him to eat, he thought, well, the only way I can beat Randy now is if I know more about the Bible than he does, and I'm going to convince him he's wrong. And so in solitary confinement, David just started poring over the Bible, became convinced of who the Bible taught and teaches that Jesus is, submitted his life to Christ, and became a follower of his. In solitary confinement, full of lawlessness, right? A piece of wheat that looked a lot like a weed. Now, it goes from there, right? End of his 10 years, he gets out. But he realizes in that time with Randy going back and forth that he also really liked arguing. So he went back to college. He went to Old Dominion in Virginia. Somehow he got in. Went to Old Dominion in Virginia and joined the debate team. Now, another member of this debate team was a young Muslim man who spent his time trying to convince David that Allah was the true God and not Jesus. In his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, Nabil Qureshi outlined his friendship with this guy named David. He outlined the time that they spent together going back and forth about who God was. He outlines the way that God and the Holy Spirit slowly but surely started convicting him of his own sin and how wrong he had it. And as the title of the book suggests, in seeking Allah, he found Jesus. In writing that book, he touched millions of lives. Whew. Mine included. You see, somewhere around 2015 to 2017, I was searching. I'd spent my whole life in a religious organization, and I was sure I had God and Jesus figured out. There were nice, clean boxes for them. And I couldn't figure it out, but something seemed wrong. And then I read that book, and stuff started to click and come together. And we could go on and on about my story, but the short thing here, the emphasis that I'd like to leave us with this one point, is if somebody had looked at the amount of lawlessness in David Wood's life as an 18-year-old kid and give him the justice he actually deserved, at that moment, I might never have had Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus to help point me to the one true God. It's a reminder to me that the King is in control. That the farmer knew what he was doing in allowing weeds to grow among his wheat. And that somehow, even though to others it looked like a messy field, to Jesus, it was a good enough parable to say the kingdom of heaven is like. It also really stands out to me. I just want to leave us with this one thing. That reality of justice. It can be really easy for us to want justice on our own terms and in our own ways. But man, God's got it figured out so much better than we do. So much better than we do. So as we close, I'd like to leave us with a couple reflection points. Things to think about just for a moment. There are three questions. The first, in what ways do I need to adjust my expectations and actions to match the reality of the kingdom of heaven? Where are my expectations and what is reality? The second, where and to whom can I display grace and mercy? The way that Jesus has done so for me. And the third, is bitterness consuming me because I desire justice in my own way or in my own time? Let's take a moment and reflect.